Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. I am your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're speaking with Dr. Rachelle Sampson, a pioneering researcher and leader at the overlap of psychedelics and business leadership. And we brought her on today to talk about the revolutionary study that she is leading on how psychedelic experience impact business executive decision-making. Now, Rachelle went through our very first cohort of our practitioner training program. We also talked about why she joined the training program, what background she came from. Interestingly, she's an associate professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, a senior research fellow at the Wharton School's ESG Institute, and serves on the board of directors for the USONA Institute. And Dr. Sampson is recognized as a thought leader in long-term investment and innovation and has received the prestigious Penmuir House Prize for her work. In our conversation together, Dr. Sampson and I discussed the genesis and key findings of the Connected Leadership Project, observations and transformative experiences and their impact on leadership, the longevity of psychedelic effects in business contexts, concerns about narcissism in leadership and psychedelics, and the potential for psychedelics to catalyze systems change in business and beyond. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Dr. Rachelle Sampson. Rachelle, it's great to have you on the podcast. I know you've also been a longtime listener to the podcast, so I'm really thrilled to be able to dive into the details of psychedelics, leadership, and systems change with you today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks so much, Paul. It's really a delight to be here, and it's great to see you again.
So as I was reviewing some of your background and context, and I may have known about this before, but it escaped my mind, I noticed that you did your doctorate at the University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And my mom went to the University of Michigan. My older sister went to the University of Michigan. I grew up watching the football team, and I'm from Michigan itself, from Grand Rapids. So just as a way to get us going, I'd love to just hear a little bit about why you chose to attend the University of Michigan for your doctoral work, and what was it focused in particular on?
Oh, sure. To see that in context, I had moved to Australia when I was in high school with my family. And so I finished high school. I went to undergraduate. I went to law school. I was admitted to the bar there. I worked as a corporate attorney for a while. I worked for the public defender for a while. And then I also worked for EY as a consultant. And so that's where I was coming from. And my last job in Australia before I moved back to the US was as a consultant for EY. And I was very interested in doing more long form thinking, if you will, right? Consulting and lawyering, for that matter, you're driven by the billable hour, and clients, not surprisingly, are only willing to pay so much. And I was interested in diving really deeply into questions that I was interested in. So I started looking for doctoral programs in the United States because I was from the US. I was interested in moving back. And I looked at a number of programs on sort of around business economics specifically, because that was close to sort of my practice work and practice area as a corporate attorney and as a consultant. I was very interested in business strategy. So, corporate strategy, if you will. And there were a number of programs that were very strong. I interviewed at a number. I flew back to the US. I visited a number of them, and I loved Michigan. What can I say? It was strength of the program across departments. Ann Arbor is a fantastic college town. My future colleagues or peers in the program who I met while I was there were fantastic. And it did not disappoint. It was a wonderful experience. And so while I was there, it was pretty traditional academic work, right? So I did business economics, or I studied business economics. I did a lot of work on this sort of intersection of law and economics. So I did a lot of work on kind of structuring of R&D alliances between firms and, technology development, and how to structure those to get the most out of it, and how to select partners appropriately, et cetera. So that's what I ended up focusing on for my doctorate.
And, executive coaches as an archetype, and many of them, they're very diverse, right? There are some
Mhm.
individuals who have PhDs like yourself. There are some individuals who are clinicians, clinical psychologists, have chosen to become executive coaches. There are some who are not clinicians whatsoever, who have just done this work. Maybe they had an executive leadership role in a corporation, and they're like, okay, I want to transition out of that and really support people. So I'm curious from your lens, as not only a lawyer, but also someone with a PhD from one of the premier institutions in the world, how did that initial work sort of help you prepare or set the groundwork for your later work as an executive coach? What way in which did it help you cut your teeth, or did it help develop a foundation so when you chose to step into coaching, you felt confident and capable with the skill set that you had already established?
Sure, that's a great question. So this is a little bit of post hoc rationalization,
Yeah,
because if you had
perfect.
told me during my PhD that I was going to become an executive coach as well, I would have probably laughed and said probably not. But so many things have led to my role as an executive coach as well, and it's work that I love. But specifically around my academic training and how that's helped me. So one of the things that we do as an academic, and I did like a large scale empirical work, looking across companies around things that affect firm performance. But in the process of that, I also talked to lots and lots of managers because you're trying to understand it from their perspective. What are the mechanisms? What's driving them? What are the pressures that they're facing? How do they see their competitors, et cetera? And I always learned so much from my conversations with them. So it's kind of twofold. So one, over the course of my academic career and the research that I've been doing, I've had exposure to, dozens of companies, dozens of executives sort of firsthand, but then thousands of companies through my empirical work, and where you can observe patterns at this more 30,000-foot level. And, so it's one thing to have anecdotes, right? Well, this company did this thing, or this leader chose this, made this decision, and this was the outcome, right? And we can look at that and say, that's great. And maybe if another leader in another firm were to choose to do that, they would get the same outcome, or maybe not, because we don't know exactly how representative that is, or what we would call like the covariates or cofactors that would lead them to be, say, successful or less successful in that chosen strategy. And so that's the benefit of the kind of research grounding. And it just changes the way that you think. So it changed the way that I think. Law school was a real sharpening of my mind in terms of analytical and critical thinking. And then the PhD was a whole other level around that. And so I just gained a real appreciation for the complexity of the decision landscape that we're facing managers, or it's facing managers. I was training managers. So, I taught at NYU was my first academic gig. So I taught MBAs exclusively there. I also taught at Georgetown, same thing. Now I teach at Maryland. And I teach pretty much exclusively graduate students there. So I have lots of throughput of managers going into roles. So all of that exposure has given me a lot of grounding in business and strategy and the underlying landscape economically. But I also, just working with students, many of which are executive students, I, was informally often coaching them anyway and working with them through this kind of translation of what was going on for them personally and their decision making, et cetera, and how that translates into their workplace. But later, I became involved in a research project, which I'm sure we'll talk about, around kind of psychedelics and leadership and decision making specifically. And I was aware that a lot of my work was, sort of at this arm's length level, right? And I had not spent much time really reflecting on the deeply personal processes that go on as people shift their perspectives and make different kinds of decisions. So I decided to embark on some coach training about 5, 6 years ago. Just sort of standard transformational kind of coaching practices and things like that, just so I could better understand this process. But I found that I absolutely loved the work. And so built a small coaching practice on the side. And those are sort of skills and tactics on working on that more interpersonal level. And it
Mhm.
sort of just also gives me greater insight for the other research projects that I'm engaged in what does this look like? How are they best supported? What does that look like, et cetera?
Well, it sounds like a regenerative feedback loop, right? Where sort of, I would say, heaven, to use a very Taoist term, heaven meets earth, right? You can have the 30,000-foot view and see what I'm hearing in your communication is the pattern recognition of, if you look at a macro level, what is successful in corporate strategy or what is successful for X, Y, and Z outcome. But what can be equally important is the on the ground, in the trenches, interpersonal work of actually helping managers and leaders and executives to navigate uncertain terrain. It's sort of both the map and also navigating the territory. And that will lead into my next question, which is, it's now been, as you said, several years that you've worked as an executive coach. It's been even longer that you've studied business and corporate strategy and been a teacher. And as a transition into talking more about psychedelics leadership decision making, I'm curious how your perception of business strategy, success even has sort of evolved and developed
Mm.
over these last 10 years, especially as you've gone deeper now into the psychedelic landscape.
Sure. So I guess to situate that a little bit, and I think at least in part answer your question, the genesis of my moving into examining sort of the impact of psychedelics or consciousness expanding experiences on making by leaders, I guess about 15, actually it's longer, closer to 20 years ago, I started doing a lot of research work around environmental sustainability, equitable workplaces, and really trying to make the business case for doing those things, right? So the whole idea
Interesting.
was like, let me give you the facts and information across thousands of companies as to what practices work to improve the bottom line and when, so you can take them to your investors, your board of directors, and you won't get the same kind of pushback, right? And there are a lot of leaders and decision makers who were very, very interested in that work, right? Who really well intentioned. This is what they wanted to do. And I thought, well, great. I'm just going to give them the best evidence possible to help them make that case. Well, lo and behold, so I did a lot of research and teaching work in that area. And lo and behold, information doesn't actually lead to change in the way that we would like to think, right? We all think of ourselves as these kind of rational actors, et cetera, that, if we're presented with information that, say, contradicts our viewpoint, we'll change our minds. But we know that that does happen in some cases, but in many times it does not. And so this observation is not unique to me. And there were many others who I was speaking to in this space and who shared kind of similar, confusion and were perplexed by the situation. And so I was like, okay, this is clearly not working, right? And if we're interested and these are among managers and like CEOs who really wanted to do this, right? So it's not like they were just paying lip service because I didn't work with those sorts of people. Um, so clearly something was getting in the way, right? And that's when I sort of was exposed to psychedelics, right? So I read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. I have a colleague, Bennett Zellner, who's also my co-author on this research project, which we'll be talking about, I'm sure, who was kind of deeply immersed in this space. So I had some awareness through him. And I sort of thought, wow, what would happen if we took these sort of consciousness altering substances and looked at the impact in business leaders? Like, would it change their ability? Would it help them make these kinds of shifts that they're professing to want to make, or not? Right. So it's a question, and that's kind of what led to this sort of segue into this research concerning leadership, decision making, and psychedelics. And that's where this sort of connected leadership project was born. And that's what I've been working on for the past 5 years. And that's why I also enrolled in the inaugural program through Third Wave, was I was very interested in understanding better what, about psychedelic integration coaching and what that would look like and how to support leaders and how could we make sure we picked the best spaces to conduct this research, because these are non-clinical populations, right? So we're not looking at diagnosed conditions. So I really wanted to understand that better. And of course, I got to meet some incredible peers along the way. And we continue to learn from each other. So that's been a wonderful community and is a wonderful community to be a part of. So let me pause there. There's many different directions we can go from here.
And one of the aspects or things that's coming up for me is, when we think about psychedelics and leadership, when we think about the capacity to make decisions, especially in large organizations, there's so much inertia that often is moving in the other direction. And this is, even as part of our training for the practitioner program, one of the books that we read was by a guy named Robert Fritz. It's called The Path of Least Resistance. And he really focuses on the importance of structure and the container. When we talk about psychedelics, we think of it as set and setting, but when you're in a large organization, there's a certain structure or scaffolding that's already in place, and to actually shift that, even if the leader really wants to actually shift that and make it happen, can often be quite challenging. I just wanted to unpack that a little bit more from your lens. Why is it that even though you were in communication with executives and leaders who really wanted to make change, why was it that it was so difficult to actually implement things around environmental sustainability or more equitable workplaces? What did you notice and observe from your time in the trenches there?
Yeah, well, you've touched on a number of things, right? Through this reference to structure. I mean, we all operate in systems, and systems can be very healthy, right? They can lead to stability over time, or they can be unhealthy if they're unhealthy systems. But the by and large of it is that it's very resistant to change, and that's both a blessing and a curse, right? In terms of thinking about sort of the leaders and so the anecdotes and stories that I heard were by the dozen, right? One is, well, I'm more interested in the unlimited upside of putting my energy and interests into, say, new market development, right? And, you're telling me about maybe some efficiencies or energy savings or, and most individuals don't realize, say, the value of a resilient supply chain until they don't have their supply chain. So like, watch what happened with COVID, right? So, all the supply chains and all these companies realized how very reliant on China they were and how almost their entire supply chain was dependent on China. And so they became very focused on, okay, this is not sustainable. And that's a different kind of sustainability, of course. But those sorts of problems lead to it. So there's an element of they're not interested in anything that doesn't have a killing for an upside. That's one. Two, they're just not necessarily trained to think in this way. Three, they're pointing to the investors, saying the investors will never let me do it. But if you talk to the investors, some of the investors are interested in, more sustainable practices. They view it as risk reduction, right? But also as market creation in some cases. And they'll point back to the managers and say, well, the managers are too short term. It's compensation schemes, like how you set up the compensation, under what time horizons are you compensated. A lot of times they're just too busy, right? They are so strapped for time that they just can't consider more things, and they want to, but they have very limited attention. And then there's also bringing everyone else along the path, right? So it's the typical, it's very org change, right? Traditional kind of org change. And how do you achieve that? But I want to come back to the Fritz book you mentioned, because I think the structure as I see it through that book is a little bit different, right? There's kind of the way that and this is sort of how I think about and how I approach sort of this kind of coaching practice, and also how I imagine and see with some of the leaders who are coming through in our project. is that there's kind of two frames. So one is the what do you want to create, right? And sort of, and it's not an intellectual sort of outcome per se, but it's kind of an emotional attachment to a different way of being.
Mhm.
And sometimes we don't know exactly the path to get there, right? So a perfect example of this is Ray Anderson, who was the founder of Interface Floor. They made those square carpet tiles, right?
Yeah.
He passed away some years ago, but he was a real visionary in sustainability. Initially, he was a CEO of a traditional carpet company, and they were putting tons of carpet into landfill every year. And he had an epiphany. And, whether it was his grandchildren, he basically said, we can't do this anymore. We need to
Mm.
find a way to be completely regenerative, right? Totally circular economy. Nothing goes into landfill. Okay, I have no idea how we're going to get there, but I know where I want that endpoint. And so that's the structure you're putting into place, right? You have an acknowledgement, a really honest, non-judgmental acknowledgement. This is where we are. Lots of carpets going into landfill. But we know we want to be fully regenerative, right? Totally circular economy, no waste created, fully upcycled materials. I don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but we know it's this direction. And then the map making kind of happens along the way. And so it's really, that's the structure for leaders, that they're trying to put into place. And there are dozens of skills that are essential for that, right? So I don't want to downplay, tactics and experience and kind of communication and how do you implement this and because you have to bring a lot of people along, right? But if you think about the leaders and organizations who have made the most sweeping changes in economies, they tend to be of the visionary variety, right?
Mhm.
Where they've envisioned something. They don't necessarily know exactly how they're going to get there, but it's a compelling vision, right? And people get behind it because of kind of this emotional attachment to it. And then there's all the nuts and bolts of how do you do it, right? And that's super important. But that's the structure you want to kind of put into place. So there's kind of these two varieties of structure. One is the systems we're in, but also how do we set up this process for change so there's this kind of magnetic pull towards it. And then it's not just this intellectual, oh, we're going to shave a little money here and there by being more efficient in our organization. Nobody gets excited about that, right?
Right.
It's the crafting of the vision that becomes really important.
And that's, in reading this book, Mastering Leadership, which I think I briefly talked about even in the practitioner training program that we had, Bob Anderson rolls out, it's a leadership circle profile. There's p-values all over the place. And he said there's really two things that determine the success of a leader based on the research that they did. One was teamwork, the capacity to communicate and create a really great team. The second thing was the vision, and the vision of what we're moving toward. Because when we craft that compelling vision and when we can communicate it both to ourselves, but also to the people in around us, that helps us to really visualize it and experience it and feel it. There's a very healthy creative tension that's
Yeah.
opened up, which I think is what you're speaking to, right? That magnetic pull. And so that creative tension then is actually what can keep us inspired and motivated and even showing up on the days when we're not that motivated, when we don't want to necessarily, because there's this thing that's like drawing us into the future. A phrase that I've heard to describe this are attractor points.
Mhm.
ATTRACTOR, that these attractor points in the future, it's like we are compelled to pull through. And this is where I think the topic of psychedelics, especially in 2024, with how in vogue, popular, how much research is coming out about them, they're very interesting because one of my hypotheses is that psychedelics can really help us to clarify that compelling vision and remain inspired in the face of challenge, adversity, and difficulty. And so this is where I'd love to kind of now come to the main course of our
Mhm.
conversation, which is the research that you have pioneered at the overlap of psychedelics, leadership, and decision making. And I'd love if you could just start by explaining the context of that research, the questions and inquiries that you've explored through that research, and then I'd love to continue to unpack it further with you.
Yeah, wonderful. I'd love to. And just as a kind of preamble to that, to build on something that you said on the vision part, it's this embodiment of it, right?
Right.
And which is different. And we're learning more every day from neuroscience, about that, our neurology is not just in our brains, right? It's through this full embodiment. And there's these differences between what's characterized as left brain and right brain in terms of the thinking and things like that. But when we're fully embodied and there's this knowing that isn't just a pure intellectual knowing about the vision, that's when it tends to be compelling. If it's just pure intellectual, this is what I should do, then it becomes like when we're trying to change a habit. Oh, I, do better if I ate more vegetables. That's not compelling, right? It has to be this kind of deeply embodied knowing that actually will lead to behavioral change, right? So starting with that as a point. So the project which you're referring to is the Connected Leadership Project, which is, I'm a principal investigator, as is Bennett Zellner, my colleague at the University of Maryland. So he and I started this project several years ago with an interest in looking at how and whether and how consciousness expanding experiences will, through psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, would change how leaders make decisions, right? Leaders face, as we know, this unprecedented complex landscape, and it's getting more complex by the day, right? Political unrest, social unrest, economic uncertainty, climate uncertainty, et cetera, right? So really complex now landscape. So, creativity, openness, mental flexibility is really important, right? And being able to meet those kinds of challenges. And we know from psychedelics, from the neuroscience that's gone on before, what happens when people take psychedelics, right? So you have connectivity among the different parts of the brain that you don't see in, the normal kind of placebo states, if you will. And then this has been shown to lead to, say, more open states, being more open to different ideas. It's led to major breakthroughs. As you well know, there's many, say, like researchers, for example, that have credited their major scientific discoveries from the impacts of psychedelics, right? So clearly something's happening here. And so what we were interested in is whether or not this would lead leaders, because psychedelics also increase these perceptions of connectedness to themselves, to others, to the natural world. We know this through the work of Rosalind Watts, that would they make decisions that are more consistent with that, right? So not necessarily just say prioritizing investors, but also say, for example, considering relevant outcomes for employees, their communities, the environment, et cetera, right? So make a broader array of decisions, or, not just focusing more narrowly on one group, and then also being able to take into account a longer decision horizon, right? So when we know this from psych research, that basically when money is scarce or time is scarce, we enter into what's called tunneling behavior. And what tunneling behavior is exactly as the name implies, right? We get a very narrow focus and we focus really on the short term, right? And so think about like the stereotypical CEO, of a large company, particularly like a large public company. They're constantly managing money and they're constantly scarce on time, right? So it's very hard. And one of the chief complaints that you hear is that unless they're very intentional about it, they don't get time to do the long-term thinking, right? And they don't get that kind of space to do that. And so they become very focused on the quarter right now, which, a lot of these decisions around, say, environmental sustainability or equitable workplaces, they do tend to pay off for these organizations, but they tend to it's not immediately observable. It pays off in the medium to longer term, and something we don't measure well. So it's not observed right away. So that's kind of like the bulk of the genesis of what we're looking at. So what that led to is an identification of sort of mechanisms perceptions of connectedness following, what is the intensity or the amplitude of the experience that they have on, say, psilocybin. How does that change their perceptions of scarcity? And then ultimately what happens in terms of their time horizons, like how they perceive, what's important, right? And then the breadth, of the consideration set in their decision making. So that's kind of the sketch of the project. We did run a pilot, which we concluded last summer in 2023. So they had their psilocybin retreat through a legal jurisdiction that is the Netherlands through synthesis, which unfortunately no longer exists, at least in its former incarnation. And so basically what happened is these executives opted into a leadership-themed retreat with synthesis. And Bennett and I, basically enrolled into the study from those participants. So it was observational just for the pilot. And we basically measured and tracked them for a year following that. So really long-term follow-up, which is very unusual in these studies. And we have learned so much from that, both through quantitative work, through scales and psychometric measures, but also the qualitative interview data that we've been collecting. And the interview data is fascinating, as you might imagine. It's kind of the varieties of experience. And not just sort of the reports of their experience through on psychedelics or through psilocybin, but just also what they reported afterwards, right? And we have the whole gamut of choices that they made afterwards. Everything from, I didn't feel very much, or I haven't really made differences, but I am curious to try it again, to complete 180, CEO founders, leaving the company that they founded to do something completely different, or taking a 180 on their business products and processes and looking for different sources of finance that would be more consistent with the mission that they were now shifting and altering, to how they interact with other individuals and VCs and how they make decisions. And it's very interesting. Many of them downplay the impact of their experience. So they'll say things like, well, it wasn't a big deal. I haven't really noticed that much, but I noticed that, and this is somebody, fairly senior person, walking into a meeting with lots of VCs and partners and law firms, et cetera, and saying, but I don't get triggered by all these people I used to get triggered by. I know exactly who I should work with and who I shouldn't. I am much clearer in my decision making. But it's not a big deal, right? And, but these are these kind of 1 degree shifts, if you think of. So if you imagine like a big container ship at sea, or a large vessel at sea, they make a 1 degree shift in their rudder. In the short term, it doesn't look like such a big thing, right? You kind of look like you're in the same place, really. But you give it a few weeks, few months, few years, you end up on an entirely different continent, right? Because of these kinds of shifts in perception, awareness, et cetera. And we also got to observe durability over time. And what are the things that impacted durability, which is something we don't know very much about, right? So most of the psychedelic studies, even when they consider sort of long-term outcomes, they're looking at like 3 months out, right? And so it's people who have practices, people who have peers who've also had similar experiences that they can talk to, which kind of brings in an interest in working with teams and organizations, because if you have other people who've had similar experiences, you don't feel so isolated. So having a community, right, of other leaders, it doesn't have to be in the same organization, can really help when those systems are kind of pushing against making changes and shifts. So we got to really witness some beautiful group interactions too following. So we had individual interviews, but we also had group meetings over time following this cohort. And we would watch them coach each other, because they had different skills and expertise, right? Even though they were all leaders in some form or another, everything from CEO, founders of fintech or products firms to partners in law firms, et cetera, right? And everything in between. They would help each other. And because they had that shared experience, they were very bonded. And I just want to share this story too, because you've probably seen this too, Paul, but it was such a delight to watch. So when we arrived in the Netherlands for the synthesis retreat, and the synthesis format was a 5-day retreat, and there were 2 dosing sessions, and they use psilocybin truffles, which of course are the legal form of psilocybin in the Netherlands, and they make a tea from it. And the first dosing session's lower, the second dosing session's higher, and that dose is determined in consultation between the participant and their facilitator, one-on-one, who's usually a psychotherapist with deep experience in this space. And, before the first dosing experience, we got to be involved in the conversations and the groups. And there was a lot of the typical kind of business language and discussions. They're all, telling, oh, you do this. Oh, I can hook you up with this person who does that. And, there's a lot of kind of business as usual. And, some of it's posturing. I don't mean to downplay it in that way, but there was a lot of shininess, right? And armor that we present with, right? And I'm guilty of that too, right? In certain settings. And after the first dosing experience, it all fell away. And
Wow.
suddenly the nature of the conversations among the participants completely shifted to a point where at the end of the retreat, and this was both beautiful and heartbreaking, some of the participants said, I have never been able to speak with anyone at this depth before in my life. Right? Which I'm so glad that they were able to experience that. And also it's so heartbreaking that people did not experience this until this point in their lives, right? These are not, 15-year-olds, right? These are leaders in organizations. I think our youngest participant was in their late 30s. So,
Okay.
and most of them were, late 40s, early 50s.
Right. Right. Wow. Wow. So powerful. And we noticed this even at the early days of synthesis in 2018 when I was helping to support a lot. We would frame it early days as a wellness retreat. And we encourage people who were looking, for a new idea or to, for like creativity, leadership, and well-being. And what we found time and time again is people would come in for these specific reasons, these external, maybe shiny reasons. And then after we would have the high dose ceremony, which was often a very high dose. It could be equivalent of 4 to 5 to 6 grams of dried psilocybin mushrooms. We were working with truffles, of course, which is different. But the way the conversation changed and how much more focused it became on relationships, specifically relationships to spouses, relationships to kids, relationships to family, relationships to friends. There was a thing that I noticed in which relating is so core and central to who we are, but for so many of us, especially in business or corporate work environments, it's actually the last thing we think about and consider in our lives. And so to see that 180, totally, it like comes back to the connected leadership project, right? There's a way in which that psilocybin experience helps us to remember the way that healthy relationships, healthy relating really nourishes us, in a substantial way.
100%. And as you probably would have experienced too, talking with other leaders, it's lonely at the top, right? There are very few people who really understand the kinds of pressures that they're under, right? And so, yes, there are all of their personal relationships, which are often suffering because of the levels of stress and the demands on their time that are there. And so this helps them so much relationally. But it also connects them with people and puts them in community with other people who also understand those pressures, right? And then that's, I think, the thread where coaching really can come through too, because, if you want durability of effects, and I think we're seeing this and we're doing more testing. We're recruiting for 2 cohorts right now this year, one starting in this month or this next month in June, one starting in October, and we'll run more next year as well. So we can see what changes durability, right? And it's what we hypothesize, right? And we're seeing anecdotally, we only have small numbers, so we can't conclude, right? Is, community, some kind of contemplative practice, stronger relationships at home, right? and deeper connections with themselves, right? This is all an inside job, right? And it's the ripple effect, right? So as we focus internally on our own healing, transformation, support, and recognition of our own wholeness, and really come from a place of deep knowing in that way, it will begin to just naturally ripple out from that place to all our relationships, right? And we see this like when people, heal wounds in themselves, right? Or recognize their innate wholeness, suddenly, just almost automatically, their relationships start shifting, right? And they either become healthier or they part ways with people that perhaps they're not meant to be working with or in relationship with. And then it starts spilling over into work, right? And all those work relationships. And so it just starts moving out from there. And this is what we're really trying to understand. It's kind of what we're calling social neuroscience, if you will, right? So how does something that's deeply personal experience, like through a psilocybin journey, right? They come in, like you said, with these shiny goals, and some of them get them, right? Some of them get those big flashes of insight around their work. But a lot of times it starts with very personal work. And how does that eventually translate outside into their workplaces, right? These are people who have a lot of influence, lots of resources at, I won't say their disposal, right? It's not their personal consumption, but they're force multipliers, right? So when they make shifts around their perceptions, how they see the world, how they relate to others, you are going to see outsized impacts because of the number of people they touch through their organizations and the organizations and individuals that they touch. So, and that's why, for me personally, it's such a compelling place to focus, and I'm so passionately interested in, both observing, measuring, but also accompanying these leaders, and supporting them and understanding what are the best practices, and is it like some people say, you have to do all your personal work before you can get the big business insights, or, what does that actually look like? We don't know systematically, right? And so, the research is rigorous, right? It's well designed, it's under IRB, et cetera, right? All the bells and whistles, and the things we need to try to identify these things. But the intention is not only to inform this, social neuroscience, as I'm calling it, but also to better understand the practices. What is supportive? What leads to durability? What leads to translation into your full life, right? Including your work life. What do we know about that? And there's just so many interesting questions, that have such impact, that are just waiting to be investigated. So, this feels like something that I could be looking at for the rest of my career.
Yeah, and I would agree with that this overlap of psychedelics, leadership, decision-making is rich for exploration. And, having completed the pilot study now, you're opening 2 new cohorts.
Mm-hmm.
How have you refined sort of your approach, or what additional questions are you now asking with these new cohorts that have opened up that maybe you weren't aware of or weren't as present with the initial pilot project?
Great question. So a few things. So one, we're interested because the varieties of decisions that these leaders look at are so varied because they're in very different contexts. We're looking at some more behavioral mechanisms using kind of potentially experimental techniques, which is getting on like more how their preference ordering and things like that. And then using the more qualitative work to actually get the anecdotes and the descriptive stuff. And we can do empirical work with that too. So one is we're kind of pulling back and trying to look at, these perceptual shifts that manifest in ways that we can capture through experiments within this population rather than just psychometric measures. Psychometric measures, I have a lot of respect for them. Clearly, we rely on them, but they can sometimes be aspirational. They, people will answer in ways that they want to be rather than how they truly are. So one way is through running kind of these, behavioral experiments within these populations. That's one way of getting at, how they would make decisions in ways that they don't necessarily see what you're capturing, which is really important. So that's one way of doing it. Another that we're looking at, that we're not going to do it for these two cohorts next year, is to be able to identify people around the individuals who can talk more about what they notice in them as well.
Mm.
So that kind of reflective measurement is really important. We're also getting at metrics that capture more sort of openness and creativity. The other part, which is we haven't really touched on, but it's coming up a lot, particularly in this business context, is this issue around narcissism.
Mm.
And,
Interesting.
so there are people who know much more about this than I do. I just read sort of the press around it and some of the studies and talk to people who are deeply engaged in this area. But one of the questions we get presented with repeatedly is, well, how do you know that this won't just make them into narcissists, right? And by that, I mean, kind of give them this sort of messiah complex that they have all the answers to everything and make them, sort of even almost more isolated than they were before, and less willing to take input, which isn't necessarily a healthy thing. And so it's not leading to that connection. And, there's a lot we could go into around this, but I think it's probably longer than what we have time for today. But we're very interested in, one, what are the supportive mechanisms that can help people from slipping into that to the extent that that's an avoidable condition, right? Or an enhancement of that as an avoidable condition. And or are there, what we would call covariates, right? Or sort of some sort of traits that make some people more susceptible to that than others, right? And I'm not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be one, to take this with a huge grain of salt. But, my lay person understanding of narcissism is it's coming from deep wounding, right? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes professional drive is also coming from deep wounding, right? It can be a compensatory mechanism, proving self-worth. I can do this, right? It gives them this incredible drive to achieve, right? And in some ways that's awesome, right? Because we get these amazing inventions and businesses and such. And sometimes people are not driven by wounding. I want to be clear about that. This is not everyone. But to the extent that those things are kind of correlated, we might expect to see, and people have raised this with us, which is why I'm bringing it up, are there more narcissistic personality types in this population? And how does that influence the impact on the outcomes? And we don't know. So we're capturing things that may allow us to say something about that, right? And also, again, what are the kinds of supports that may help people from slipping into those places, right? But I know that's a kind of a big Pandora's box to open
Yeah,
up.
we could probably do a whole episode on that. This relationship. It's funny. I was just having a conversation last week with a pretty well-known, Bay Area tech CEO, and we were talking about exactly this, that a lot of folks, especially in the tech industry, who are founders or entrepreneurs, have had more narcissistic tendencies or a messiah complex that's almost been encouraged by the Silicon Valley ethos. So if they didn't start that way, it could have been sort of conditioned into them to some degree. And so there's sort of a razor thin line then of psychedelics can certainly amplify that and enhance that if there isn't the appropriate humility, co-visibility, accountability around them. And I think also it is partly dependent on the psychedelic that one might take. There could be a greater preponderance for a messiah complex or narcissism through something like 5-MeO at a breakthrough dose compared to maybe just MDMA, which is a heart opener. So I think that nuance and what you're speaking to in the larger context that we're having this conversation around is, the vast, vast, vast majority of research that's been carried out in the psychedelic landscape is specific to clinical and therapeutic conditions.
That's right.
And while that's necessary and important, what I fully believe is that the vast majority of people who will really change the systems in which we live in through psychedelic work, it's still a very uncharted landscape. I mean, literally, I can only think of a few specific research efforts that have been dedicated to this overlap of psychedelics, leadership, creativity, that lens. There's been other observational research where certain outcomes have been sort of piecemeal pulled from different papers to be more cohesive. But I think what you and Bennett are doing through the Connected Leadership Project is so critically important for us to really understand how do we so often talk about a new paradigm, right? A new paradigm, a new world, a new earth, depending on how hippie we are. What might that actually look like from a systems change perspective? And I think that's what you're really exploring, is that overlap, not only between psychedelics, leadership, and decision-making, but then also systems change. And how might we create more sustainable and equitable systems for all of us to live with it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big question. You know, I don't make any apologies for my viewpoint that, we're in peril, right? We face an existential crisis on this planet. And, I am a researcher first, which means I don't know the answer to the questions, which is why they're questions. But I ask the questions wondering if these are potential, factors that can lead to systems change, right? And this is where, that is, coming back to the start of the conversation, heaven meeting earth, right? So it's that, large, like looking at it through this research lens, but also kind of meeting it with how we understand the process of change in individuals. Because my sort of working hypothesis, if you will, is that it's going to come from people working within themselves, right? And then that translating out into the systems change, right? Through that kind of ripple effect that we talked about earlier, right? Through their relationships, their work, making those shifts. And that it's, the hope that I have is that this can be a nonlinear process, right?
Right.
So it's kind of the contagion effect, right? Almost think of it, it's sort of a kind of a terrible analogy in some ways, but it's the easiest one to conceptualize. Is it's like the spread of a virus, right? It starts very slow, one or two people, just a little cluster, then a few more, and then all of a sudden, boom, right? And, so it's possible potentially in a positive way as well, right? As, people become more deeply connected to themselves and, realize there's more to us than, just this kind of physical existence, if you will, and do that depth work, become more connected with themselves and others. And then that sort of spills out, and it can, I believe it can happen in a nonlinear way, and with, not to say it'll be easy, but with greater ease, right?
Right.
Than we might imagine. And so I'm curious what part psychedelics may play in that.
Yeah, because mushrooms, they have a interesting relationship with death. And so I don't think it's any
Mm,
coincidence that as a lot of our old systems are dying, we're in many ways rooting in mycelial intelligence to help us to navigate the birthing of what's to come. So I deeply appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know we've been wanting to do this for a while now, and it felt like the perfect timing with completing the pilot study and now enrolling these next two cohorts. And just for folks, if they want to learn more about the Connected Leadership Project, if they want to learn more about your work, what can they check out after this episode?
Absolutely. Thank you. So they can check out our study site, which is leaders.study. And there they can connect to the ongoing recruitment for cohorts that are happening. Our retreat partner in the Netherlands is Kiyomi Retreats,
Fantastic.
which is a wonderful organization. And they also work with Gabor Mate, et cetera. So leaders.study is one. And then there are links to Bennett and myself there, so you can learn more about us and our background. And I think if you can include those in the show notes, that would be awesome. I'd really appreciate that to get the
We'll do
awareness
that.
out there.
So leaders.study
Mhm.
is the place to check out Dr. Rachelle Sampson. Again, I really appreciate you sharing so much of your wisdom, insight, knowledge with us on the podcast today. I learned a lot, and I hope, I'm sure many of our listeners also learned quite a bit. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Such a delight to be here with you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey listeners, it's Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Dr. Rachelle Sampson. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of the episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mentioned in this episode, including information about the Connected Leadership Project. We'd love to know what you thought of the conversation, and you can let us know in Third Wave's community, our free platform where you'll find support, discussion, as well as educational resources and providers across our global ecosystem. You can sign up for free at community.thethirdwave.co. Make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you listen to your podcast so you never miss an episode. And please, if this episode was interesting or insightful or inspiring in any way, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complimentary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.